On Saturday, once again, completely out of nowhere, with no warning whatsoever and apparently no forethought, Joe Biden called for regime change in Russia. Watch this.
A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never erase a people's love for liberty. Brutality will never grind down their will to be free. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Doing his Churchill routine. Fine. When things aren't going well at home, all presidents seek solace abroad, where they're taken much more seriously than they are by their own voters. But he couldn't stop himself. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power, Joe Biden said of Vladimir Putin. Now, set aside how you feel about Putin. You probably don't like him, and for good reason. Our policy, according to the President of the United States, is to take Putin out, to remove him as head of state. To be clear, regime change in Russia has never been American policy. And this is hardly the first time we have tangled with Russia. We've had far more threatening circumstances than this one. The United States, you'll recall, waged a proxy war against the Russian government for 11 years in Vietnam. Nearly 60,000 Americans died in that war. And yet, no American president mentioned regime change at the Kremlin. Why? Because they were soft on the Russians? No. Because Russia has about 6,000 nuclear weapons. So let's say we eliminated the Russian head of state and, of course, that country's central government. What would happen to those weapons? Well, let's see. In Iraq, Saddam's weapons stockpiles, all conventional, wound up in the hands of militia that used them to kill Americans. So Russia has a large and restive population of Islamic extremists. Do we think it's possible that with no one running the country, because of course we have no chosen successor to Putin, is it possible, if we did that, that one of those 6,000 nuclear weapons might wind up in the hands of some anti-American terror group and be used against our civilian population here? A nuclear weapon. Well, that's not just possible, it's likely. And that's if we were to succeed in killing Putin. What if we don't kill Putin, as apparently is now our policy? The President of the United States just informed the Russian government that he seeks its overthrow. So you have to ask yourself, does hearing that make Vladimir Putin more or less likely to use a nuclear weapon against the United States and Western Europe? How do trapped animals behave? Well, they lash out with fangs and claws. Desperate people are dangerous people, of course. So it would be in the interest of the United States, and that's the only interest that matters from our perspective, to cool the rhetoric a little bit. Or when you employ overheated rhetoric, to do it for a reason, in the service of a clearly articulated goal that helps the United States, and not just because you're old and pissed, which is exactly what you just saw. A guy who just lost control of what he was saying because he was too mad. It's all pretty obvious. No one in Washington has spent 30 seconds thinking about what would happen if we knocked off Putin, or if we talk about knocking off Putin. In fact, our foreign policy establishment spent the weekend congratulating Joe Biden on saying the wrong thing. They compared him to Ronald Reagan. Washington loves regime change. It's what comes after regime change they'd rather not consider and have no track record of pulling off. But for now, they were thrilled. Bill Kristol compared Biden's threat to Reagan, telling Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall because everything in D.C. is cliche-based. Rick Wilson agreed, quote, Biden did tear down this wall for our era. Again, the cliches. Dumb people speak and think in cliches because they have no other terms at hand. Former White House correspondent at CBS News, Mark Knoller, said Biden was even better than Ronald Reagan. Quote, tops Reagan's 1987 tear down this wall speech. Okay. To its credit, for once, the White House did not run toward the applause. There are apparently still an adult or two working there. And they immediately tried to tell us that Biden hadn't actually meant what he told us on camera. He didn't really mean it. Any statement that begins this way is a lie. The president's point, okay, we can discern his point. He said it. But the president's point was that Putin cannot be allowed to exercise power over his neighbors or the region. He was not discussing Putin's power in Russia or regime change. Right. Well, that's, of course, not true, but at least it's reassuring to know our policy remains the same. Neocons in D.C., of course, were highly distressed. CIA operative Rodney Farron, for example, wrote this, quote, this would have been Biden's tear down this wall moment, but for White House staffers watering down his meaning afterward. A few hours ago, Biden once again stepped in front of the microphone and reaffirmed that the words that had accidentally slipped out of his mouth over the weekend because he was mad and he has no self-control are actually, officially, U.S. policy. Here's Joe Biden.
Do you believe what you said, that Putin can't remain in power? Or do you now regret saying that because your government has been trying to walk that back? Did your words complicate matters?
Well, you asked 3 different questions. I'll answer them all. Number 1, I'm not walking anything back.
I'm not walking anything back. So regime change in Russia is now our policy. That's what the President of the United States just told us. And as he did, he rebuked the people who worked for him, which is fine with us. They spent all week correcting statements that he makes up on the fly and hasn't thought through in any way. Purely reactive. Hey, Joe Biden, what would be the long-term effect of the United States of what you're doing? No idea. Don't have to think about the future now. When everything is suddenly at stake. There has never been recklessness at this level in the White House. And yes, that includes the last president, who was often attacked for being reckless. Nothing he said compares to this. Fox's Peter Doocy asked for clarification. And in response, Joe Biden revealed that he is completely unaware that his staff has been continuously updating American policy all week as he changes it on the fly. Watch Joe Biden.
Are you worried that other leaders in the world are going to start to doubt that America is back if some of these big things that you say on the world stage keep getting walked back?
What's getting walked back?
It made it sound like, just in the last couple days, it sounded like you told U.S. troops they were going to Ukraine. It sounded like you said it was possible the U.S. would use a chemical weapon, and it sounded like you were calling for regime change in Russia, and we know...
None of the 3 occurred.
None of the 3 occurred?
None of the 3.
Mr. President?
You interpret the language that way.
What's getting walked back? To be clear, he's not fit to lead, particularly right now. Bernie Sanders scared the hell out of the banks, Democratic Party short-circuited his campaign and installed Joe Biden. Biden seemed kind of passive for a lot of voters. That was a welcome respite from the last president who seemed kind of loud. Okay, that's what actually happened. No one anticipated at that moment that we would be on the cusp of a war with a nuclear-armed power in less than 2 years. But that's exactly where we are now. And under those circumstances, to have someone who has literally no idea what's going on, doesn't even know that he's changing longstanding policies that adults have thought through, when he does it, does scary describe that? No, it's worse. So Biden just said everything that he has said for the last week is true, and none of it has been corrected by people who work for him. The truth is, Joe Biden has no idea. Joe Biden has no idea what his publicists say when he goes to sleep. Then midway through his answer, Biden starts walking back his own comments. He does that just minutes after saying he would never walk back his own comments. None of that occurred, Biden said. Look, it feels almost like we're being mean to the guy by quoting him, and no one wants that. No one is making fun of his age or his diminished condition, only trying to defend the country. Then moments later, Biden declared that no reasonable person would think he wants regime change in Russia. Watch this if you can stand it.
Because it's ridiculous. Nobody believes we're going to take down. I was talking about taking down Putin. Nobody believes that.
All right, joke's over. Too much is at stake. If there was ever a time, if there was in U.S. history ever a time to invoke the 25th Amendment, it is now. As Joe Biden himself put it, for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power. For all of our sakes.